Once again, Christian greetings to all our valued listeners and viewers throughout the whole world, even more particularly to all Shepherd's Rod believers, and most especially to our beloved brothers and sisters in the United States of America. Special greetings to our brethren in Colorado, in Georgia, in Kansas, in Missouri, in Texas, Arkansas, Chicago, Illinois, in California, in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Canada, Mexico, Spain, Africa, Kenya, Pakistan, Zambia, to the United Kingdom, and to our brethren in Australia, and also in Malaysia and in Indonesia, and to the rest of the 144,000 living saints scattered abroad. Greetings. May the good Lord bless you, my dear brothers and sisters. This is our special episode number 13, just an hour exposition of prophetic study as the last final warning message just prior to the close of provision. And this time, we focus our attention to Revelation 11, verse 1 and 2. The last two verses on the subject on Revelation chapter 10, as stated on 2TG number 14, page 16. It says, the subject of chapter 10 ends with the second verse of chapter 11. The verse which brings us to the time of the numbering of the people, which obviously is the numbering of the 144,000. Revelation chapter 7, verse 3 to verse 8. For they are the only numbered company of people in the thread of prophecy. Thus it is that chapter 10, including verses 1 and 2 from chapter 11, begins at the time of the end and ends with the numbering of the 144,000. 2TG number 14 on page 16. So here the Shepherd's Rod is plainly telling us that the subject on Revelation chapter 10 ended on verse 1 and verse 2 of chapter 11. And the statement says that the subject of chapter 10 begins in the time of the end. And we read several times in 3 symbolic code, 8 to 10, page 8. The Shepherd's Rod says that the time of the end, in more specific terms, in a spatial sense, began in the year 1844. So the inter-subject of Revelation chapter 10 began in the year 1844 and ended to the numbering of the 144,000 living saints, as stated by the Shepherd's Rod. Now here in tract number 5, page 109, it says, the investigative judgment of the dead consequently takes place in the heavenly temple only, whereas the investigative judgment of the living takes place in the heavenly as well as in the earthly temple. While the records are being made up for the books in the heavenly, the people are being investigated for the separation in the earthly. Matthew 22, verse 11 to 13. Z. Malachi 3, verse 1 to 3. And as the measuring is figurative of the same work, what work? Investigative judgment. It says, and as the measuring is the figurative of the same work, then it leads to the conclusion that the temple, the altar, and them that worship therein must figuratively represent the three classes to be judged. So, the Shepherd's Rod plainly told us that there are only three classes to be judged, and that is the temple, the altar, and the worshippers. Now, the temple and the altar, it says here, the temple and the altar, inanimate objects, must characterize two classes of inanimate saints, the two classes of dead saints. These two classes of dead saints are categorized by inspiration through the resurrection. The temple are those who will be resurrected at the second visible coming of Jesus Christ, whereas the altar are those who will be especially resurrected on Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Now, I would like to read here in 2SR page 110. It says here, while the altar, a spatial and smaller object, must represent a spatial and smaller body of righteous dead, the righteous who died from 1844 on and who are to come up in the spatial resurrection of Daniel 12 verse 2, early writings, page 285, track number 5, 110. So those passages that we read, brothers and sisters, can be easily understood that the focal point is the proceedings that took place in the heavenly sanctuary. And the term measuring, brothers and sisters, saying is figurative of the same work of investigative judgment. Therefore, to measure the temple, to measure the altar, is to know the proceedings of the temple as well as the altar. The altar are those saints that will be resurrected in Daniel 12 verse 2, or in other words, they are the saints who died under the last seal that pertains to the dead. And we know that the last seal that pertains to the dead is the sixth seal. So the altar represents the saints who died under the sixth seal. Now, Revelation 11 verse 1 and 2 is still a part of the subject in Revelation chapter 10. But Revelation chapter 10, brothers and sisters, is under the description of the sixth trumpet. Now, I would like to remind again, here in track number 5, on page 35, it says, track number 5, page 35, naturally, then, the first seal must precede the first trumpet. The second seal, it says, the second trumpet, and so on, like the needle and the shuttle, rather than that all 7 seals must precede all 7 trumpets. So the shepherd's rod is very plain that in the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy, it must be that each seal must precede its matching trumpet. So the sixth seal must precede the sixth trumpet. Now the sixth trumpet is even more directly pointing to the proceedings in the holy place. Now let us read track number 5. Page 78. Track number 5, page 78. It says, the sixth trumpet, from Revelation 9:13 to Revelation 11:14. So chapter 10 is covered under the sixth trumpet. And it says, chapter 9, verses 13 and 14. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel, which had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Then it says, in coming from the golden altar, the command, loose the 4 angels, shows that the sixth trumpet sounded sometime before the veil to the most holy apartment of the heavenly sanctuary was lifted. Otherwise, the voice would have come from the throne, the most holy place. And also in the statement on, let's read here, track number 5 on page 31. Let it not, however, be understood that the respective destructions revealed in the subject of the 7 trumpets must be one and the same in time an event with the corresponding destructions of the 7 last plagues. For such a conclusion is made impossible by the fact that the voice which spoke to the angel at the sounding of the 6th trumpet, saying, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates, came from the 4 horns of the golden altar. Revelation 9, verse 13 and 14. The altar, being in the holy apartment of the sanctuary at the sounding of the 6th trumpet, proves that the trumpet sounded before the most holy apartment was opened for use. For had it been used, the voice would necessarily have come from therein, where the throne is. Hence, the sounding of this trumpet had to take place before the door of the most holy was opened and the throne occupied. Track number 5, page 31. So, the shepherd's rod is very plain that the mere fact that the voice came from the golden altar, and the golden altar is located in the holy place, obviously, therefore, I would like to go directly to the exact and perfect explanation by saying that that voice that came from the golden altar, which is in the holy place, is the voice of Jesus Christ, the voice of the Son of the living God. Now, it's easy to understand that the mere fact that the voice came from the golden altar indicates that Jesus Christ is in the holy place. Jesus Christ is in the holy place. Now, let us ponder deeply, brothers and sisters. Let us distinctly separate the sixth trumpet in the judgment that pertains to the dead and the sixth trumpet in the judgment that pertains to the living. Now, concerning the sixth trumpet, brothers and sisters, I would like to emphasize that in this study, it is even more directly pointing to Christ's mediatorial work in the heavenly sanctuary. We are so familiar that in the Levitical priesthood, before the high priest will enter to the most holy place, there must be sounding of trumpets to inform God's people, to prepare their lives, because the high priest is about to enter into the most holy place. There are 10 days proclamation as the Feast of Trumpets, 10 days prior to the Day of Atonement. Now, in this instance, we can easily discern that the 10 days in the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy is equivalent to 10 years. Each day for a year. Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4 verse 6. And we know that the main subject on Revelation chapter 10 is the book of Daniel. That little book recorded on Revelation 10 verse 2, as explained by the Shepherd's Rod in 2TG number 15, page 3, that there is no other book that had been opened except the book of Daniel. And concerning the book of Daniel, we know that it points directly to the proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. The sanctuary mentioned in Daniel 8, verse 13 and 14, as stated by the Shepherd's Rod in track number 3 on page 53. It says, "This startling revelation shows conclusively that the cleansing according to Daniel 8:14 is first of the sanctuary in heaven and second of the sanctuary on earth." So the focal point of the vision of Daniel is the sanctuary in heaven. Now, we know, brothers and sisters, according to the Shepherd's Rod, let us read White House Recruiter. On page 19, it says, "The only revelation of new prophetic truth subsequent to the Reformation is the announcement of the year in which was to begin the work of cleansing the sanctuary, primarily in behalf of the dead, based on Daniel 8 verse 14, but not then fully understood. As its announcement was made by the first-day Adventists, it necessarily follows that they were the third group of servants with a new and distinctive message, and as is well known, they started proclaiming it in the year 1833, announcing that the cleansing of the sanctuary was to commence in the year 1844. Thus, in 1833, the clock of the parabolic time struck at the hour of 6. White House Recruiter, page 19. So that is very plain. When does God raise up the Millerites movement to proclaim the cleansing of the sanctuary? 1833. So from 1833 to 1843, that was 10 years. So typifying the 10 days proclamation of the Feast of Trumpets prior to the time when the high priest will enter into the most holy place. Now, in the parable of Jesus Christ, Christ's coming to the most holy place was illustrated by the coming of the bridegroom. Here in 2SR page 181, it says, 2SR page 181, "The midnight cry was first proclaimed prior to 1844, and the coming of the bridegroom was Christ coming to the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary for the investigative judgment of the saints." The investigation being in two sections. First, the judgment for the dead, and the second for the living. The cry must be repeated. Otherwise, we would have no present truth for the time of the judgment of the living. The crime for the living being of a greater importance to the world than the one for the dead, and as the virgins are a figure of the living church, the parable must have a direct application to the church at this present time, the coming of the bridegroom for the judgment of the living. 2SR page 181. So, we can connect one subject to the other, brothers and sisters. So, to repeat again, according to track number 5, page 99. Let's read again the statement. Track number 5 on page 100 rather. Page 100. Events to take place just before the seventh trumpet sounds. It says, events to take place just before the seventh trumpet sounds. What events? Revelation 10 verse 8, 9, and 10, and Revelation 10 verse 1, 2, and 3. So the proper arrangement of the events is Revelation 10, verse 8, verse 9, and verse 10. And we are now studying the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy. What is verse 8, verse 9, and verse 10? Brothers and sisters, it is pointing to the event by which the messenger, represented by the angel, when he ate the little book, and that little book is the book of Daniel, sweet as honey in his mouth, but became bitter in his belly. Since Revelation chapter 10 has a double application, in the primary application is to the dead, and the experience by which it become bitter in their belly, that is the great disappointment. But in the application in the judgment that pertains to the living, the significance that it became bitter in their belly is that they experience delay. Therefore, Revelation chapter 10, verse 8, 9, and 10 is even more directly applied to the dead rather than to the living, because disappointment is more bitter than delay. But what I'm trying to explain is that Revelation 10, verse 8, verse 9, and 10 has a double application. Primary application to the dead, pointing to the disappointment. In the application in the judgment that pertains to the living, they experience delay. And then we need to focus to Revelation 10, verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3. So, it's very important to understand, brothers and sisters, because those are the events that will take place before the seventh angel begins to sound. Now, we already explained several times that the angel, the mighty angel in Revelation 10 verse 1 is also the angel mentioned in Revelation 11 verse 1, saying, and there was given me a reed like unto a rod. Now, here on 2TG number 15, page 3, let us read again. It says, this angel has all the characteristics of a power that sends down the latter rain and that causes the spiritual grain folly to develop. For that is what cloud, sunshine, and rainbow indicate. As a rainbow never appears without rain, the angel is therefore the angel that brings the rain and the sunshine for the development of the final harvest. Now, this angel in Revelation 10 verse 1 cannot be applied to William Miller, because this angel, God bestowed unto him the latter rain message. And according to one symbolic code, number 5, page 5, just to read again the statement, one symbolic code, number 5, page 5, as to the time of the former and the latter rain, the former, according to the meaning of the word, preceding in time or place, must naturally precede the latter. Therefore, the desire of ages is correct. For the church before the shepherd's rod came, the experience of the apostles was the former rain. Whereas to us at the present time, the former rain is the prophecy and the latter rain is the shepherd's rod. One symbolic code, number 5, page 5. So, Revelation 11 verse 1, it says, and there was given me a reed like unto a rod. That is the shepherd's rod publications, by which the latter rain message is recorded in the shepherd's rod publications. And we know that there are only two sections in the Exodus movement. First, the section led by Moses, and the last section led by Joshua. When Moses died, God passed the rod of God from the hand of Moses and gave to Joshua. And without any doubts, Revelation 11 verse 1 must be antitypical Joshua. Now, let us now focus our attention to Revelation 11, verse 1. The messenger is being commanded by God. And what is the divine command? Measure the temple, the altar, and them that worship therein. Now, let's read Revelation 11, verse 1. It says, and there was given me a reed like unto a rod, And the angel stood saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. Now, if this messenger is busy-hearted, been able to measure the temple, the altar, and the worshippers. And what does it mean by the divine command, measure the temple? We already read in tract number 5, 109. It says that the measuring is figurative of the same word, investigative judgment. So what does it mean by saying, measure the temple? Since it is figurative of the same word, which is investigative judgment. I remember the statement in tract number 5. It says here, in tract number 5, on page 108, it says, tract number 5, page 108, the investigative judgment, tract number 5, 108, the investigative judgment decides the cases of those who have professed faith in God and who in consequence have had their names recorded in the books. Daniel 7 verse 10. But some of whom have not endured to the end. It determines which name shall be retained and which shall be blotted out. So not until the investigation is completed, the sanctuary cleansed from unworthy members will the books show the exact number of names that will be retained and accounted worthy of life eternal. Now, what is the exact number of names that will be retained? Let's ponder deeply this statement, brothers and sisters. According to the Shepherd's Rod, there is only one numbered company of people, and that is the 144,000 living saints. Now, I would like to read again, 2TG number 14. It says, 2TG number 14, page 16. The subject of chapter 10 ends with the second verse of chapter 11, the verse which brings us to the time of the measuring, numbering of the people, which obviously is the numbering of the 144,000. For they are the only numbered company of people in the thread of prophecy. They are the only numbered company of people in the thread of prophecy. Who are they? The 144,000 living saints. So here, brothers and sisters, in tract number 5, page 108, can be easily understood by saying, so not until the investigation is completed. So when the investigation is completed, the sanctuary cleansed from unworthy members, will the books show the exact number of names that will be retained. What is the exact number of names that will be retained? 144,000. When does the subject on Revelation chapter 10 ended? It ends with the numbering of the 144,000. So what had been revealed? What had been given by God information unto us? Only the exact number of names. But we do not know. Who are they? But for sure, the exact number of names cannot be mistaken. There must be 144,000 names that have been retained in the Lamb's Book of Life. Exact number. But we do not know. Who are they? It was not revealed. Because the only revelation given by God to His messenger by giving the divine command, measure the temple, measure the altar. Concerning the temple and the altar, of course, it must be pointing to the time when does the investigation of the temple ended? When does the investigation of the altar ended? And when does the numbering of the 144,000 ended? Now, it says here, brothers and sisters, the most important part of this work, tract number 5, page 108, the most important part of this work, however, is not the numbering, but the separating. So, the most important part, in reality, is not the numbering, but the blotting out of names, the separating, the sitting of the judicial tribunal to gather, parabolically speaking, the good into vessels, but to cast the bad away from the net, which contained the dead from Adam's time up to 1844, when it was again cast out to cast the 144,000 living saints. Now, let's go back to our subject. It is very important, brothers and sisters, to understand proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. For it will completely answer all the happenstance that will take place on this earth. Now remember, in the judgment that pertains to the dead, the occurrence is only in the heavenly sanctuary, right? Let's read again the statement in White House Recruiter. White House Recruiter, page 20. It says, as the cleansing of the sanctuary in behalf of the dead is necessarily purely a book transaction, That is the reason for its taking place only in the heavenly sanctuary. But when the proceedings will be on the judgment that pertains to the living, according to answerer number 3, page 6, it says, but when the judgment, harvest of the living shall begin. Answerer number 3, page 6. But when the judgment, harvest of the living shall begin, then of necessity, the sanctuary on earth will be cleansed from the hypocrites, and the sanctuary in heaven from their names in its records. Both sanctuaries are therefore affected. So, that is the reason why the judgment that pertains to the living is even more important. Now, I would like to connect again the statement given in track number 3. Page 50 and page 51. So let's read. Track number 3, page 50, page 51. As the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, track number 3, page 50, page 51. As the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary is a work of cleansing the books by blotting from them the names of both the backsliders and the thieves, and as at the time of trouble, such as never was, since there was a nation, the only ones who shall be delivered are those whose names are found written in the book. The cleansing of the books, therefore, obviously takes place before the resurrection and before the time of trouble such as never was. Thus, the unfaithful dead will be left in their graves at the first resurrection, and the unfaithful living will be left without deliverance from the coming trouble. But were their names allowed to remain in the books, then according to the records, either the wicked dead would have to be resurrected with the righteous, and the living wicked delivered with the living righteous, or else both the righteous dead and the righteous living would have to be forsaken with them. Alternatives, both of which, of course, are impossible. Thus, again, making mandatory and absolute separation as instanced in type in Joshua's time. There is an accursed thing, said the Lord, in the midst of thee, O Israel. Thou canst stand before thine enemies until you take away the accursed thing from among you. And Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan and all that he had, and all Israel stoned him. Joshua chapter 7, verse 13, verse 24, verse 25. And we know that that is called the Valley of Achor. Now ponder deeply, brothers and sisters. You can read it again, and again. Track number 3, page 50, page 51. That according to the shepherd's rod, since recorded in Daniel 12 verse 1 that all the names that had been written in the Lamb's Book of Life, not sealed with 7 seals, are to be delivered at the commencement of the time of trouble. Then, if the names of the wicked were allowed to remain there, according to the shepherd's rod, then of necessity, God would oblige to deliver the wicked together with the righteous, which is an impossible thing. The shepherd's rod made it so plain. Conclusively, therefore, before the commencement of the time of trouble, all the names of the wicked must be blotted out. All unworthy names must be blotted out. Now, these 3 prominent events, Great Tribulation, Little Time of Trouble, and Time of Trouble, all of them are called Time of Trouble. The Great Tribulation is also called Time of Trouble. But the little time of trouble never been called Great Tribulation. It is called Little Time of Trouble. The Great Time of Trouble never been called Great Tribulation. But the Great Tribulation is also called Time of Trouble. Therefore, brothers and sisters, before the commencement of the Great Tribulation, the books, the Lamb's books of life, are already completely cleansed. All the names of the wicked, or all unworthy names, must be blotted out, according to the shepherd's rod. Where the names of the wicked are allowed to remain there at the time when the Great Tribulation commences, then the wicked will be saved. But we know it is impossible. And that is the reason why the shepherd's rod says, therefore, before the commencement of the time of trouble, brothers and sisters, all the names of the wicked must be blotted out. Now, I would like to read here in track number 3. Track number 5, brother. So let's read page 110. It says, track number 5, page 110. So we are now focusing Revelation 11, verse 2. But the court which is without the temple, leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles. And the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. So here, brothers and sisters, there are 3 clauses The first clause is pointing to the proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. But the second and the third clause is pertaining to the occurrence on earth. Therefore, brothers and sisters, Revelation 11 verse 2, both sanctuary are affected, heavenly as well as the earthly. And according to answerer number 3, page 6, that is only pertaining to the judgment that pertains to the living. Now, let's read the statement here in track number 5, 110. But why leave out the court? Why not measure it also? For since it is a part of the building, it too must be symbolical of saints. Obviously, because it represents the great multitude which no man could number, measure, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues. Revelation 7 verse 9. The last who came from among the Gentiles, the court, in other words, is symbolical of the immeasurable, innumerable harvest of second fruits brought in after the measurable, numerable harvest of first fruits, the 144,000. It is not measured, meaning investigated, because it represents those among whom there are no bad to be cast out, for they are gathered in after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. Now, brothers and sisters, the statement is very plain. The great multitude, they are gathered in after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. Now, the subject is heavenly temple. Now, concerning the gathering in the heavenly temple, first in the holy place, then in the most holy place. And according to the shepherd's rod, that there are only 3 classes to be investigated: temple, altar, and worshippers. Where? In the holy place. Not in the most holy place. Because in the most holy place, all the saints must be investigated. Otherwise, their sins will not be blotted out. So the investigation by which the great multitude will no longer undergo, will no longer pass, is the investigation in the holy place. Why? Because they are gathered in after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. Now, there are 2 great multitude. I would like to say, brothers and sisters, the great multitude which pertains to the dead and the great multitude that pertains to the living, are resurrected saints and living saints. We know great multitude is gathered from all nations. There are only 2 classes of saints, gathered from all nations and gathered from many nations. Now, in October 22, 1844, the first one that had been cleansed is the third heaven. So the sanctuary in the third heaven, which is the most holy place. And only the righteous will be brought to the most holy place. So the temple, they are gathered into the most holy place after the third heaven, the sanctuary third heaven, is cleansed. So what is the cleansing? All the books where the names of the wicked were inscribed therein are transferred to the second heaven. Transferred to the second heaven. And the only books that remain in the third heaven is the Lamb's Book of Life, sealed with 7 seals, and the Book of Life, sealed with 7 seals. The Book of Jesus Christ and the Book of God the Father. But all the rest of the books were in the second heaven. Now, we explained several times, brothers and sisters, that on March 27, 2021, March 27, 2021, in Bible calendar, this is October 10, 2022. The sanctuary in the second heaven, which is the holy place, it was cleansed. All the books by which the names of the wicked are inscribed therein are transferred into the first heaven. And it's also called holy place. And that is why it says holy places. So, the Lamb's Book of Life, which is divided into 7 divisions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It was already cleansed. All unworthy names have been blotted out. But there are 7 books, as stated by the shepherd's rod. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Because the 7th seal is divided into 7 subdivisions. These books are empty. And all the names to be inscribed into this book are the names of the righteous. Of course, the first one is pertaining to the first fruits, the 144,000. And the rest is pertaining to the great multitude. And it is called the second section of separation. So all the names of the righteous will be taken out. For example, this is the book represented by the field. The names of the wicked and the names of the righteous are recorded into this book. The names of the righteous, of course, will be blotted out in this book and then will be transferred to this book. Brothers and sisters, it is called vessels. This book here is called barn. This one is vessels. Let me read to you the statement in the Shepherd's Rod. Track number 8, page 92. Track number 8, page 92. Inasmuch as both the field with the wheat and tares, Matthew 13:30, and the net with the good fish and bad fish, Matthew 13 verse 47 and 48, represent the gospel church during the period in which the saints and the hypocrites are commingled. Then the vessels into which the good fish are placed after the bad are cast away from among them, and the barn into which the wheat is placed after the tares are separated from it, must necessarily represents the church passing from its unclean state, field or net, into another is purified state, which is symbolized not by the field or by the net, but rather by a barn and by vessels. A new place, safe and clean, where henceforth there shall no more come the uncircumcised and the unclean. Isaiah 52 verse 1. So, the vessels, that is in the holy place, the barn, that is in the most holy place. So, hoping we understand, brothers and sisters. So, the only sanctuary in heaven to be cleansed is in the third heaven and in the second heaven. But the sanctuary in the first heaven, all the names of the wicked will be there, will forever remain there, brothers and sisters. All the names, together with the fallen angels and the devil. So, we need to understand the cleansing of the sanctuary and the cleansing of the books. Now, I would like to read again the statement here. In consecrated way to Christian perfection. It says here, on page 113, the cleansing of the sanctuary and the finishing of the mystery of God are identical as to time, and are also so closely related as to be practically identical in character and event. You see, the cleansing of the sanctuary and the finishing of the mystery of God are identical as to time. And identical to what? To time. That when the sanctuary is cleansed, the mystery of God is also finished. Because they were identical to time. It says, and are also so closely related as to be practically identical in character and event. Now, I would like to connect first to one of the very important subject connected to Revelation 11 verse 2. We read several times, brethren, that according to the card file of B.T. Hopper, let us read. So it says here, card file, February 1953 by B.T. Hopper, just 2 years before he died. It says, it is possible that the 42 months of Revelation 11 verse 2 occupy an entirely different period of time than the 1,260 days mentioned in Revelation 13. For Jerusalem did not begin to be trodden underfoot in 538 AD, but was completely taken and destroyed in 70 AD. Or in other words, the Shepherd's Rod is telling that in 538 AD, there was no more sanctuary on earth. It was completely destroyed in 70 AD. The same with the statement in track number 5. It says here, in track number 5, page 107, during the period of the sixth trumpet, there is no literal temple. You see, during the period of the sixth trumpet, there is no literal temple. No more literal temple because the literal temple was destroyed in 70 AD. But Revelation 11 verse 2 is under the description of the sixth trumpet. So let us read again the card file. It says, it is possible that the 42 months of Revelation 11 verse 2 occupy an entirely different period of time than the 1,260 days mentioned in Revelation 13. For Jerusalem did not begin to be trodden underfoot in 538 AD, but was completely taken and destroyed in 70 AD. The holy city is still underfoot and will be until the Gentiles drive out the Gentiles as predicted in Zechariah chapter 1 verse 21. Not any part of the city will be underfoot after then, at which time the kingdom, the church purified, is set up there. The truth concerning the 42 months during which time the holy city is trodden underfoot by the Gentiles is therefore not completely revealed and had better be left alone until God makes it known. So the bottom line is that the 42 months prophecy in Revelation 11 verse 2 was not yet fulfilled. Because the fulfillment of that prophecy must be during the period of the sixth trumpet. And concerning the period of the sixth trumpet, commenced in 1833. The sounding of the trumpet before the high priest entered to the most holy place. But that was the primary application. The perfect fulfillment of the prophecy commenced in 2011. In 2011, Jesus Christ is already in the second heaven. The mediatorial work of Jesus Christ is already in the holy place. And according to the type, Jesus Christ is in the holy place for 10 years. 2011 plus 10, then we will fall in 2021. And we are now on the very year by which all prophecies will finally be materialized and be fulfilled. By which not only in the heavenly sanctuary, but as well as the earthly temple will be affected. And it is even more pertaining, my dear brothers and sisters, the occurrence that taking place in Palestine. It is closely connected to the occurrence or the current event that taking place in Palestine. So we'll continue this subject on our next episode and hoping that the good Lord will bless us and will help us. Thank you very much for listening and viewing this program. May the good Lord bless you and have a beautiful, wonderful evening.